This is Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Arts organizations across our region have received alarming letters in recent weeks. The letters inform them that their federal funding is gone. The National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities have both announced major federal funding cuts that'll affect organizations like the Fletcher Free Library and the Flynn in Burlington, the Henry Sheldon Museum in Middlebury, and the Vermont Symphony Orchestra. Do you work for or perform with one of these organizations that's lost federal funding? What impact will that have on the arts and the performances that you've been a part of? Or perhaps you think that federal dollars should not go towards funding the arts. Give us a call and tell us more at 800-639-2211. Joining us for the first part of this hour is Susan Evans McClure. She's the executive director of the Vermont Arts Council, which is the Vermont partner agency for the National Endowment for the Arts. Susan, welcome back to the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we were just half joking in a sad sort of way that whenever you come on the radio, it's to talk about some difficult news for the arts. But first, before we get to all of this, just tell us a little bit about what the Vermont Arts Council does when you're not trying to figure out massive federal funding changes.
Sure. Well, the Vermont Arts Council is the state's arts funding agency. We've actually been around since 1965. And our mission is really to increase access to the arts for all Vermonters. So we do that through direct grant making, through support services, and through promotion of the arts and culture across the state. Our funding comes from a mix of funding from the national government through the National Endowment for the Arts and through the state of Vermont. And we are, interestingly, actually the only state arts agency. There's 56 state and jurisdictional arts agencies. We're the only one that operates as an independent nonprofit. So we also are able to bring in some private funding to support our grant making. And the work we do statewide is really about lifting up the profile of the arts and also ensuring that artists can work here and can live here and that the arts are part of our lives and our education across every community of the state.
So tell us some more about some of these big changes that we've seen just in the past week or so in terms of federal funding for the arts.
Yeah, so just about a week ago, a little over a week ago, although all of this seems to be moving so quickly, It's hard to keep track of, but just about a week ago, the National Endowment for the Arts issued termination notices for many of their direct grantees. The way funding for the NEA works is that when Congress approves the money for the NEA, it specifies that 40% of their grant funds go to support state and jurisdictional arts agencies and regional arts agencies, and the other 60% the NEA gives away in direct grants. So the changes that happened about a week ago actually did not affect state arts agencies. So I'll start by saying that our federal funding still, as of now, remains intact. We are very grateful for that. That means we are able to continue subgranting those funds to artists and arts organizations across the state. However, there were several organizations that received grant termination notices. You mentioned a few of them in the opening of the show. And what's especially challenging about this is that it's not happening in isolation, right? So this follows targeting from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Institute of Museum and Library Services, other cuts to federal agencies, including like the State Department's international arts exchanges. All of these cuts are happening across the government in ways that are negatively impacting Vermont artists and organizations.
So some of these arts organizations, they receive funding from multiple different federal agencies.
That can happen, yes. I'm sure it's not surprising to anyone to hear that it is really complicated to fund an arts organization in the state of Vermont and anywhere in the country. So many arts organizations are incredibly scrappy and thoughtful and intentional, and they piece together their funding in lots of different ways. Public funding, private funding, state funding. Many of them can receive funds from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Humanities, maybe also the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Maybe they're getting funding through USDA Rural Development to fund their building if it's centering their downtown communities in a rural area. There's lots of federal agencies that support the arts and culture because our federal government really recognizes the important role that the arts and culture play in building communities and supporting our economy.
Yeah. Well, if you work for or perform with one of the organizations that we're talking about, one of these arts organizations in our region that's lost federal funding recently, give us a call at 800-639-2211. Tell us what that organization means to you. So let's talk through a couple of these places because they're all around the state, right, Susan?
Yes. I'll say we don't have a full list from the National Endowment for the Arts of grant cancellations. We do know that not every single grant was terminated, but we have heard from many organizations that have lost their NEA grants in Vermont.
Do we know why some were terminated and others weren't?
The information we received from the NEA said that they were making those decisions based on priorities of the current administration, and that was what they said.
Okay. So there are a couple of grants that covered events that already happened. I saw 2 dance performances at the Flynn Center in Burlington were supposed to be funded by federal dollars. Those performances already occurred. The NEA also terminated 2 grants worth $50,000 that it had awarded to Northern Stage in White River Junction, and one of those is to support a indie folk musical that we actually just covered a couple weeks ago on Vermont Edition called the Vermont Farm Project, which runs through this May. So it's happening right now. Can you explain exactly how that works, how that's possible?
I can try. Well, and actually what we see with the NEA grant cancellations is different than what happened with the NEH and Institute for Museum and Library Services.
Okay.
When those grants were terminated, they were terminated effective immediately, meaning it was like over as soon as you got the letter. The NEA has taken a different approach, and they say that organizations that have open grants that were terminated have until May 31st to finish their projects and request the reimbursements. So that means they terminated grants from the federal fiscal year 24 and 25, so that some of those projects were actually done. Some of those grants were actually out in the world. The projects had happened, the funds had been received, and it was all wrapped up. So they received termination notices even though they had already received the funding. As far as we know and have heard, they will not be requesting any of that funding back. But also they said those grants were terminated and also the projects were done. I think there's a lot that's clearly unclear, if one can say that, about this process and how this was done. I think we could get into like really nitty-gritty specifics, but it's really important to look at this in a broader context of what's happening for funding for the arts and culture and the chaos around it, that there is a lot of chaos around all of these federal funding cuts. And in many cases, the chaos is part of the intent, and we're seeing that play out in our communities.
So recently, you were part of a discussion in Randolph with a number of Vermont leaders and folks from different arts organizations that have been impacted by these changes, including U.S. Representative to Congress Becca Balint and Senator Peter Welch. Tell us a little bit more about this event. What were its goals?
Yeah, well, Representative Becca Balint hosted this event. Her staff and her team, and she has been an ardent supporter of the arts and culture in Vermont, and we're really grateful for that support. What she really wanted to do was bring together a group of people who are impacted by these cuts to get a broader picture of what we're looking at, but also to remind Vermonters that at the same time that we're really struggling as an arts and culture community, this community of creative people also have the ability to bring our communities together and to help us see what could be possible next. We're still in figuring out how to get through now, but at the same time, we need to be building for what comes next. And I think that Vermont's creative community are the people who can help us figure that out.
It's good to hear some optimism amidst these changing times. Let's take a listen to a clip from a comment that Representative Becca Balint made during this May 9th event in Randolph.
I know for me that the way that we are going to get to a better place in this country is through the arts. We know that authoritarians go after the arts and education first for a reason.
I'm wondering, Susan, if you have thoughts on what that reason that Becca Balint was referring to is. What could be the reasoning behind these massive changes?
You know, I think we've seen massive changes across the entire government with this administration, and the cuts to the arts and culture organizations are just one piece of that. They're not happening in isolation. And in some ways, I think our sector was actually prepared for a direct attack on the arts on day one. But instead, what we saw has been an ongoing threatening of kind of the American systems. Public arts funding is really about believing in the inherent value of the arts, but also believing in the system that creates that funding, which is that we all pay our taxes. We elect people to Congress to make decisions about how to spend those tax dollars. And many of us in Vermont, certainly me, feel like the highest and best use of those dollars is to invest them in our communities through the arts and culture. And we really want that to continue. And we know that continuing that will be of value for Vermonters. And that's where we want to stay focused on continuing that funding through the NEA, NEH, and IMLS as we move forward.
If you're just joining us, we're speaking with Susan Evans McClure, the Executive Director of the Vermont Arts Council. Susan, per your last comment, I'm curious what you would say to folks who are listening right now who are hearing this news about cuts to federal funding for the arts, and they're thinking, I don't go to any performances that these organizations we're talking about. The arts aren't a huge part of my life, and I don't think my tax dollars should fund them. They should be funded by private donors, for example, who really, really care personally about the arts. What do you say to those folks who are out there?
Yeah, I think it is an interesting perspective to think about, right? But the reality of the way funding works for the NEA is that the entire NEA budget in FY25 is $207 million. It's 0.003% of the federal budget. And then the NEA takes that funding and invests it in every community across the country. It's in every funding from the NEA is in every congressional district. And the NEA actually funds in counties where private dollars do not reach. It's great to have private support, and we have incredibly generous private support in Vermont that really makes the whole arts and culture sector run here as it does. But what we also know is that it's really hard for that private funding to often get to the most rural communities. And even if people are saying, I don't go to these shows, you may have a child in school or have had a child in school, and those kids in school have access to the arts through their arts programming, some of which is funded by the National Endowment for the Arts as well. So funding from the NEA isn't just about funding large performances at major arts centers, which it does and we love, but it's also about understanding the value of the arts at every stage of our lives and how we can make sure that that's available to all Americans.
So, Susan, you mentioned earlier that the Vermont Arts Council still is receiving federal dollars and that you disperse that money through grants to local organizations. That makes me wonder about the other ways that these local arts groups could start to fill some of these funding gaps. I mean, in a place as small as Vermont, I imagine there's a limited number of, locally focused arts foundations or, private donors that have extra money in their pockets to donate. Yeah?
Yeah, there definitely is. We hear that from people who move here, right, and say, man, the funding for the arts is really different in Vermont than it is in other larger states and larger cities. And that is true, which is why this federal funding is so important to small rural states. I think this is an opportunity for Vermont to be part of a broader national conversation, too, about how rural states are working together. There are many opportunities for Vermont's arts organizations to tap into community support. Many of them are already doing that. But exactly as you say, in a small rural state like Vermont, there is only so far to go in terms of private funding. And that's what makes that federal funding even more valuable, because federal funding is really investing in rural communities. And it means that the funding is not going just to major cities and major cultural hubs across the country.
And there's, as anyone who's worked in the arts knows, there's a real hustle to doing this work. And in the days since we've heard about this announcement, I've heard from some folks saying, this is just going to shift the balance even more away from people with a love for the arts from doing work that involves creating art and more towards grant writing or fundraising. I wonder if you could speak to that a bit and the balance that I think people in the artistic community are trying to find between those two opposing things.
Yeah, well, first of all, I have no doubt that even under this tremendous pressure, Vermont's arts community will continue to do amazing work. There is no one more scrappy than an arts organization, and I've seen people create amazing things, right, with a roll of duct tape and some cotton candy, and they've created something incredible, right? However, that's not how it should be. We should live in a world where our artists and arts organizations feel supported. So I think that is a challenge, but I also think that it's one that Vermont arts organizations are kind of ready and willing to step up to, while at the same time, I do think many of these arts organizations are going to have to be really clear about the impact of these federal cuts, as many have already been. Just because we have a put on a show mentality, sometimes it is important to also be public about the pressures that arts organizations are under, because when we shine a light on those, I really do believe that it will lead to a point where we fix those as a society too. Yeah. So there is, yes, a lot of time that arts organizations can spend fundraising, and I'll say on behalf of the Vermont Arts Council, we are always trying to keep our grant applications as absolutely simple as possible, knowing that when we trust organizations to do their best work, they totally live up to that, and they do really great things.
Susan Evans McClure is the executive director of the Vermont Arts Council. Susan, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me. And I really encourage everyone to get out in their communities, visit their local libraries, museums, arts organizations, and buy some tickets to some arts events this summer.
Coming up on Vermont Edition, the state is being sued multiple times over for its Climate Superfund law. We'll hear what exactly that law entails and the legal battle ahead. That's in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Over the past few months, we have heard a lot about Vermont suing the Trump administration, alongside many other states with Democratic attorneys general. Right now, Vermont is involved in more than a dozen lawsuits against the president and his administration. Well, now the roles have been reversed. The Trump administration is suing Vermont, as well as 3 other states. It's all over the Climate Superfund law that Vermont passed last year. It was the first of its kind in the country. Essentially, Vermont wants large fossil fuel companies to pay the state for how much the company's products contributed to climate change in recent decades. It was modeled after the federal Superfund program to clean up toxic pollution. For the rest of this hour, we are going to explore this Climate Superfund law and what being sued by the Trump administration could mean for a small state like Vermont. You can join this conversation, and we hope you do. What do you think of Vermont's Climate Superfund? Are you glad it passed last year, or more worried about its practicality? Give us a call at 800-639-2211 or send us an email to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. Our first guest today is Patrick Parenteau. He's a professor at Vermont Law and Graduate School in their Environmental Law Center. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Michaela. Good to be with you.
Very glad to have you. So as I mentioned, Vermont is one of 4 states being sued over Climate Superfund legislation. What are the other states that are being sued? And are they in a similar boat to Vermont?
They are. New York is one of the states that modeled its law on Vermont's law. It's a little bit different, but it's essentially the same. And then you have Hawaii, which has just passed a law after Hawaii was sued by the Trump administration trying to prevent Hawaii from bringing their lawsuit. They brought it anyway. And then the 4th state would be Michigan.
And Michigan has already passed its own law?
Michigan is still developing their law. Their Attorney General, Dana Nessel, has said they'll file it when they're ready, but they're not going to be intimidated by the Trump administration.
Okay, because that was one of my questions for you, just to dive right into the logistics of these lawsuits here with you, Patrick. How can you sue a state for a law that hasn't been passed yet?
It's never been done, and it hasn't worked. As I said, Hawaii did follow through and file their suit, and Michigan, I'm sure, will file theirs as well. I look upon this initial shot across the bow, if you will, from the Trump administration as more of a political stunt, more of an attempt, which is, emblematic of the Trump administration, to intimidate people. No real respect for normal legal process. We haven't seen that at all from this administration. So it's in that kind of vein that I think you look at those lawsuits. They're not serious. They're not going to prevent the states from proceeding. What happens from here is an open question. But the move that the Trump administration has made so far hasn't accomplished anything.
Well, Vermont is also being sued by two other groups over its Climate Superfund law. Could you tell us about those suits?
Right. So the first one that was filed by the Chamber of Commerce and the American Petroleum Institute, which is the most powerful lobby group for the fossil fuel industry. And then we had a subsequent case filed by 24 what we call, of course, red state or Republican attorneys general across the country. And now we have the Trump administration. So Vermont is surrounded now by four different groups of parties and lawyers and their so-called experts. We'll see. So, this is unprecedented. I mean, I've been around Vermont for a very, very long time and watched litigation back in my day as the environmental commissioner with Governor Madeline Kunin. We were involved in some major national litigation, but nothing quite on the scale of this one.
Well, you said earlier that you perceive this lawsuit by the Trump administration to be a political stunt, but stunt or not, it could cost the state a ton of money to defend itself on this, right?
Oh, right. And when you add in all these other parties, and by the way, we haven't even talked about the ultimate target of the Climate Superfund law, which, of course, are the carbon majors or the big oil companies, Exxon, Conoco, Chevron, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So we're just talking about the first round of litigation over
you're saying those companies could and likely will sue Vermont as well a little farther down the line.
Yes, they definitely will. And certainly when Vermont gets around to sending out a bill to some of these companies for the charges connected to the damage that's being done from climate change in Vermont, the flooding and so forth, yes, there's going to be future litigation. This first round of litigation is all about constitutional law, federal constitutional law. These are attempts to knock to have the Vermont law declared unconstitutional and have these cases that Vermont is already involved in and other cases that Vermont might bring thrown out of court right away. Whether or not that is accomplished, it is going to cost a lot of money, and it is going to take several years. These cases are ticketed for the United States Supreme Court. There are at least 8 different constitutional arguments being leveled against the state right now. I don't put a lot of stock in some of them. It would take us a long time to go through all of them, but a couple of them are going to have to be decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. One of them is whether or not these cases are preempted by the Clean Air Act. Now, the state is arguing these cases do not involve regulation of emissions from power plants and other sources of greenhouse gases. They claim these are cost recovery cases for damage that the pollution has caused from fossil fuels in Vermont. It's attributable to these individual companies, et cetera. So there's a fundamental disagreement about what these cases are all about. And frankly, that's something that the Supreme Court is probably going to have to finally resolve.
Well, let's take a call here. And if you have a question or a comment about Vermont's Climate Superfund law and the lawsuits that it's facing now for it, you can call in at 800-639-2211 or email your thoughts or question to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. Matthew in Alberg is on the line. Matthew, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Thank you for taking my call. The question is, since the Trump administration already gutted the EPA of the New England, why does he persistently attacking, Vermont and its own climate laws? Every state has their own laws that they want to protect. And my question was, how can states, protect themselves from the administration of wrongdoing just to protect their citizens? I do support this because I support the global whatever, because I do know Vermont needs money, and it can't do this by itself, So, like I said, having that collaboration effort, working together to protect our sovereignty, of our lands, is very, very important, especially for, the given days.
But Matthew, thank you. I feel like part of what your question is getting at here is this issue of jurisdiction that we're talking about with our guest, who is able to make this decision that large fossil fuel companies should pay for climate change damages. Is it the states or is it the federal government? Is that also what you got from Matthew's comment, Patrick?
Yes, and the answer is that the state of Vermont is a sovereign entity. It has considerable power under the United States Constitution. There are limits to what states can do, of course. One of the arguments is that the state's suing of the oil companies might interfere with interstate commerce. That's a fair question. That would turn on whether or not the amount of money being sought against the oil companies is a reasonable amount of money that's based on science, based on fact, and can be proven in a court of law. And then the question is the amount of money sufficient to impair interstate commerce? That's a question that will be raised in these cases. If it does not do what is called undue burden on interstate commerce, and if it's not designed to protect homegrown Vermont industries, which it clearly isn't since we don't have major fossil fuel industries, if those two predicates are not met, no undue impact on interstate commerce, no protectionism of Vermont businesses, then those state laws are upheld typically by the United States Supreme Court. A recent decision by this Supreme Court, which is a very conservative court, of course, with 3 Trump appointees on it, upheld a California law regulating pork production in other states. In other words, the California saying we will not buy pork from states that don't practice humane treatment of animals that they raise for slaughter, right? So we've got recent examples of where the Supreme Court, in a challenge to a state's assertion of authority over activities that were beyond their boundaries, has been upheld. That's what Vermont is counting on. They're counting on the ability to show that the charges that they're going to level against the oil companies are legitimate, bona fide, based on evidence, and that they will not interfere with either interstate commerce or foreign relations or anything else. They're simply trying to recover the costs that Vermont is incurring. And think about what happened to Montpelier in 2023 with the flooding, right? Those are the kinds of damages that Vermont is seeking recovery for, and they have a very strong factual case for that, and we'll see how it transpires in the courts.
We just got an email from Molly in Burlington who says that they're sad to see Governor Phil Scott and Vermont Republicans side with Donald Trump in his attacks on climate action. They are defending big oil profits over the financial well-being of Vermonters who have lost so much to extreme weather in the last few decades. Now, I should note that Governor Phil Scott allowed this bill to become law last year without his signature. He did not veto it. And we're also about to hear from a Republican in Vermont's State House. So we'll get her thoughts in just a moment. But before we do, I'm wondering, Patrick, if you could tell us a little bit more about what the governor's role might be here. Does he have a leadership opportunity? Is his, now that this has become law, is that kind of it for when he could weigh in?
No, I think he does have a leadership responsibility and opportunity, frankly, to go to bat for what Vermont is trying to do here. It's really his administration, his Agency of Natural Resources is going to be central to defending this law. So the real question is, will Vermont have the wherewithal? And by that I mean the staffing, both lawyers, of course, the Attorney General's office and the Agency of Natural Resources have many of my former students as their lawyers, so they're very well trained. But in addition to the lawyers that are already on staff in Vermont, they're going to need outside counsel. These are really heavy duty. This is heavy duty litigation, and these issues are cutting edge. They're cutting edge in terms of the science and the facts and the evidence. They're cutting edge in terms of the law, the constitutional questions, the global reach of some of these issues, right? So all of this is going to be very expensive, and it's going to require a lot of the very best talent that Vermont can muster. I think it will. I think it can. But then it's also going to take years, and the legislature is going to have to be willing to support this litigation even when things get tough, and they will. Litigation is very unpredictable. And so, you just got to be ready to weather whatever happens over a long period of time, stick to it, because the companies are counting on Vermont folding, right? That's why they're suing Vermont. The same thing with the Trump administration. It's counting on if you make it hurt enough, Vermont will quit. So the real question is, will Vermont stay the course, stick to it, whatever it takes, for as long as it takes? And if they do, they've got a reasonable chance, not a guarantee, but a reasonable chance of success. And yes, the amount of money that we're talking about, the 2023 floods did over $1 billion worth of damage in Vermont, just one event, right? And we had another successive event in 2024. It's only going to get worse. The science is telling us that. Their predictions have been either on the money or understated. So we know that going forward, the amount of money that's going to be required to adapt and deal with extreme weather events is going to tax Vermont's ability to pay for all of that from within the state. That's why it's reaching out to these oil companies and saying, you need to pay your fair share. It was your products that caused this. We'll prove that in court. You have a legal responsibility to put money into adaptation that will enable the state to deal with these problems.
Patrick Parenteau is a professor at Vermont Law and Graduate School's Environmental Law Center. Patrick, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And if you want to learn more about the Law and Graduate School, you should tune into Vermont Edition tomorrow, where we're going to be playing a Brave Little State episode about the role the law school plays in South Royalton. We will also hear from 2 alums, including a current Vermont Supreme Court justice. With a slightly opposing view to what our guest just said, we have an email from Alex. Alex writes that Vermont's policies have led the state to financial ruin. The Democrats, with the help of progressives in the state house, are in desperate need of money. Alex also says that without fossil fuels, billions of people would have died from weather-related tragedies as well as starvation. And they see this Climate Superfund as the, quote, furthest thing from a financially responsible plan. Well, when the Climate Superfund law faced overwhelming support in Vermont's legislature, there were dissenting voices there, including Ann Donahue. She's a Republican state rep representing the Washington 1 district. Representative Donahue, welcome back to Vermont Edition.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here. Just a little update from me. I was at the time a Republican. This term, I ran as an independent, in large part because of the amount of divisiveness nationally, particularly because of the Trump administration. So.
Well, thank you, and apologies for that. We'll make sure we get that corrected. Representative, you voted against the Climate Superfund bill last year. Can you tell us why?
Sure. Really 2 main issues. First of all, I'd like folks to think for a minute what our reaction would have been if the first in the country political entity were to sue Big Oil was Nashville or Indianapolis. Those are 2 of the top 24 population cities in the U.S. that are larger in population than the whole state of Vermont. So for us to be out front and do this on our own just doesn't make sense. The cost that's involved, as you just heard actually from an expert on that, for what is still a fairly speculative effort. Pointing out, in contrast, we can point to big tobacco, big pharma, and even just last year when we passed the bill on treated seeds to protect our pollinators, we tied that to when other states did it. We've done that with other things so that we know that we're not the only ones attempting to create a market for seeds that aren't treated. We tied it to when there was enough of a market from other states so that we knew they would be available. And there's no reason we couldn't have done that with this. Said, let the big states start it. We will join on as amicus. We'll do the way we've done other things. So I really think that that kind of cost benefit is way out of scale for what we can afford. And the second reason is, unlike many of the other types of go for damages because of wrongdoing, this is something where we're deeply complicit. And that's really demonstrated. It's not just that we needed it and wanted it. we still need it and still want it. We are still buying fossil fuels. We're relying on them because we don't have alternatives at this point that would be able to meet our needs. So to sue saying you're doing a bad thing when we wanted it, and you had a caller just before who said a lot of people would have frozen to death. We could all still be heating with wood fires, which have its own problems. They're renewable, but they certainly create a lot of pollutants. So to say that they're the bad guys when we've been a part of it, and when we've rejected things that might be harder on an individual basis but could really have made immediate concrete changes, we've rejected those when they put burden on ourselves to contribute to reducing those kind of effects.
So, Representative, what do you think the state should do next? Should the legislature repeal this law?
That would certainly be my preference. I would repeal it and say, invest in joining the lead of other states, not continuing to do our own separate thing and having to face this kind of massive cost of fighting back. I do have to say, I think in the long run, some of the constitutional, the Clear Air Act, I don't think that those are necessarily, winning arguments, but they will take a lot of time and money to fight. I do think the fact that we continue to purchase and rely on and want these products sort of makes it a little duplicitous for us to then say, but you who are supplying us what we're buying and wanting are creating bad effects on Vermont.
Well, I can imagine it would be very hard with the infrastructure that we have for folks, even if they don't want to use fossil fuels, to suddenly just say no and stop using them.
That's right. And as a state, we wouldn't be able to do it. And we have to remember that there are a lot of non-fossil alternatives that have their own problems. We rejected nuclear. We can look at hydro and say it's wonderful, except that it results in destroying vast acreage of forest land up in Canada. I don't know if Canada could sue us for destroying their forest land because we wanted that source of energy. So there's challenges in replacing it that we haven't overcome yet, and so we do still need it. We do still buy it, and suing them seems really a little duplicitous. And we've rejected, we saw with COVID what happened when we significantly reduced driving. The impact on easing, not easing climate change, but the impact on reduced pollution from fossil fuels was immediate, saves money, saves lives when cars are driving at lower speeds. And yet I've introduced bills repeatedly reducing our speed limit from 65 to 55, few minutes of added travel, immediate impact, immediate effect on the kind of pollution that causes climate change. But we're not willing to take on that little hardship. We're willing to sue big oil. I think it's almost our own political statement. And political statements can be great as long as they don't cost us vast amounts of money to make them.
Ann Donahue is an independent state representative, formerly a Republican state rep. Thank you so much for your time today, telling us about your views on this issue.
Well, thank you.
Do you think Vermont should stick to the law and sue oil companies for its role in climate change damages? Or do you think this Climate Superfund law that we're discussing today isn't worth the money and the resources to fight for it? Call in at 800-639-2211. We have to take one more quick break, but when we come back, we will speak to Vermont's treasurer, Mike Pieciak, about his role. This is Vermont Edition. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. If you're just joining us, we are discussing Vermont's Climate Superfund law. It's made the state a target for a federal lawsuit. Under this law, companies that produce large amounts of CO2 in the past 2 decades will have to pay Vermont for what climate change has cost the state. But how exactly do you figure out that number? Our next guest has been tasked with leading the effort to figure it out. Vermont's treasurer, Mike Pieciak. Welcome back to Vermont Edition.
Why, thank you very much, Michaela, for having me.
So your role here is to create a detailed accounting of the damages caused to Vermont by the global burning of fossil fuels. How in the world do you do that?
Well, you're right. I mean, I think of our role as coming up with the bill, if you will. We have to determine sort of retrospectively and prospectively what has the impact of the changing climate been to Vermont. When you think about Vermont and you try to break this down a bit, the areas where we have the most significant impact from climate change is flooding, and flooding really through mountain valleys and streams and things of that nature. So I think part of the role here is really going to be focused on that type of climate impact, trying to understand, again, retrospectively, how much of what we've seen has been fueled by climate change. And then doing modeling out into the future that shows what are the continued effects of climate change, how much can you contribute to those effects, and then what are the impacts going to be on Vermont, and how much is it going to cost us to try to prevent those worst impacts, so try to prevent the flooding like we saw in 2023 in downtown Montpelier and Barrie and so many other parts of the state.
So, as we've heard, Vermont is the subject of multiple lawsuits. There are some Republicans and independents in the State House who say that the Climate Superfund law should be repealed. While all this is going on, is your office, are you still moving forward with this work of creating this kind of detailed accounting that we've been talking about, or is it sort of on hold until these legal challenges are figured out?
So where the status is of our work, we put out an RFI, which means a request for information. We did that with the Agency of Natural Resources last summer. We wanted to know basically to the academic community, to the climatologist community, to the academic community, this is the thing we've been tasked to do. Like, how would you approach it? What kind of information do we need? What kind of process do we need? So we basically put that out to try to get information back about how we should tackle this issue. And we got responses and we evaluated those, and we were happy to see that in the responses, there were a number that said, this type of particular flood that I mentioned, like the kind that happens in mountain valleys and streams, they do believe that it can be modeled. It hasn't yet been done. So they said there's going to be more work that needs to go into that. So when we filed a report to the legislature in January, we basically said that, this is something that's possible, but we're going to need some more time because the deadline for us to get our initial work back was basically January of 2026. So we're going to need a little bit more time, and we're going to need a little bit more money to be able to make sure we have all of the outside experts that we need to do that work and do it well. So we are waiting for the budget resolution, but we do have more money in the budget for us to do this work. We are ready to do an RFP, which would be the more formal process of actually requesting proposals from all of these various experts, and then we would select those experts and get to work. So it hasn't so much been the lawsuits that have been filed as much as it was our own information gathering that told us we need a little bit more help from the legislature. We need some more time. And we need some more money.
I should also note here that the bill tasks the Agency of Natural Resources with creating a plan for how to spend those funds if and when they do come into the state. Let's take a call from Pete in St. Johnsbury. Pete, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hello, Michaela. Just a quick comment. The impact of Vermont's reduction in fossil fuel use, our air pollution, is so minuscule as to be unnoticeable in the entirety of the spectrum, the entirety of the problem. And I think it is really asinine for us to try to solve it by going it on our own. That's all I had to say.
Thank you, Pete. So this caller, Pete in St. Johnsbury, thinks that this effort is asinine. It's not worth the work that it is going to take to holds these massive global fossil fuel companies accountable. And as we just heard from you, Treasurer Pieciak, even without these lawsuits, that work of holding them accountable is going to take years, I can imagine.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that call?
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, I think the one thing to sort of clear up is at this point, Vermont is not going at it alone. The state of New York has passed a Climate Superfund law that's quite similar to Vermont's. There are other states across the country that are considering similar action. So there is a growing coalition of states that are looking at pursuing this option. The other thing that you have to think about is, there's certainly the CO2 reduction piece, but then there's the climate resiliency piece. And to the caller's point, even if Vermont was able to reduce every single bit of CO2 that we put into the air today, we are still going to feel the impacts of climate change today, tomorrow, next year, next decade. So we need to really be thinking about resiliency. How do we build a more resilient Vermont? We are working, our office and the governor's office, on a resiliency implementation strategy that we hope to have finalized in the next 6 months or so. That's going to help spell out what exactly do we need to invest in and how much money is it going to cost. And the reason for that work is because of climate change and the growing impact of climate change on Vermont. Vermont has the fourth highest per capita FEMA spending in the last 15 years, fourth highest in the country. So we have had significant impact from climate change, and we need to focus on that resiliency piece. And that's what the Superfund is all about. How do we get money to focus on mitigating these impacts? Because at the end of the day, the simple idea here is that if you make the mess, you should have to clean it up. And that is what this effort is about.
On that note, Tom in Burlington thinks that President Trump wants to cut off our chance to recover some of the costs of extreme weather events and is making the cost of living in Vermont higher. Last year, Treasurer, in an interview with Vermont Public, you said that you were excited about the task of doing this accounting for the Climate Superfund Act. This was before these lawsuits started rolling in. Are you still excited?
I am still excited because regardless of these lawsuits and regardless of where this goes, the work that we're going to do, I think, is going to be really important. We're going to come up with retrospectively and prospectively, so looking backward, looking forward, the cost that climate change has had on our businesses, on individual Vermonters, on our municipalities. And that, I think, is going to be a really important thing for Vermont to think about and consider, regardless of where the Superfund and the lawsuit heads. But we also, of course, hope that that leads to a very productive place in terms of helping us solve for the resiliency and the cost of resiliency that we need.
Vermont State Treasurer Mike Pieciak, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us on Vermont Edition today.
Of course. Thank you, Michaela.
We know lots of you out there have strong feelings about the Climate Superfund law. If you feel like your opinion wasn't quite voiced during this conversation today, it's a topic we're certainly going to return to in the coming months. So please do send us an email with your thoughts or your questions to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. Tomorrow on the show, we're going to be talking about Vermont's only law school, which is in South Royalton. And many residents there over the years have wondered if the law school is going to stay there or if it might leave town. Tomorrow on the show, we'll air a Brave Little State episode about South Royalton and the law school and how intertwined they have become. We'll also hear from 2 law school graduates, including a current Vermont Supreme Court justice. Today's show was directed by Mary Angish. Our managing producer is John Ahrens, and our producers are Andrea Lorian and Daniela Fierro. Our theme music was composed by Myra Flynn. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch up again soon.